No, I don't think that's what Jesus believed. Matthew 10:23 has Jesus saying to the 12 who he is about to send out to replicate his ministry throughout Israel. And he says, truly I say to you, you will not have finished going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. And it's certainly true that the Son of Man is his favorite way of referring to himself, and that when he speaks of the Son of Man coming, this very consistently refers to his return. So I do think that the passage is talking about Christ's return. But what does it mean to say, you won't have finished going through the cities of Israel? If one does not read the rest of Matthew 10, it would be easy to imagine that he was sending out the 12 disciples, telling them to go around the countryside, and somehow they wouldn't finish this task. But if we stop for a moment, that really makes no sense, because Christ's return can't happen while he's still on earth in his, what we now call, first coming. Christ's return can only happen after his death and resurrection and ascension to heaven, and a period of time when he's not on earth. So it really doesn't make any sense to say that the disciples in, say, 29 AD, or whatever the exact year was, would be interrupted in their ministry by Christ's return. What else could it mean then? Certainly, Matthew 10 is a chapter about mission to the Jews. Verses 5 and 6 have Jesus telling the disciples, go nowhere among the Samaritans, don't go to the Gentiles, go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That would not be a statement that would be true for all time. The gospel ends with what we call the Great Commission, in which Jesus sends the disciples out into all the world to make disciples of all nations. But the other interesting thing about Matthew 10 is that it begins with information that makes sense in that limited context of a mission just to Israel. Jesus talks about going to a city, and if there is someone who welcomes them, to stay with that person, and then to move on to the next city. But if no one will welcome them, to shake the dust of their feet off as they go on to another town. The urgency of the timing in the first century of his ministry and mission. But then, starting in verse 16, he says, be as shrewd as serpents, but as innocent as doves. And he begins to predict hostility. He begins to promise that they will testify before kings and rulers of the earth. He says that they will be brought before the synagogues and before judges, and not to worry about what to say, because the Holy Spirit would give them the words on those occasions. And none of this happened during Jesus' lifetime. These are all predictions of things that would happen to the disciples afterwards in the first generation of Christianity, and then again in the second, and on throughout the history of the church. Given that verse 23 comes in that second part of Jesus' message to the 12, I think he's looking far beyond his own lifetime and the disciples' lifetime, and saying, you will not have finished ministering to the Jewish people, however long it takes, before I return. Sadly, there was resistance among many Jewish people to his message, and therefore the mission was always incomplete, and we still need to be a part of that mission today. but at some point, before it is complete, Christ will return.